Hey there, folks. Welcome back to another episode of the Untitled TTRPG podcast. That's the one. That's the one. With me is John, per usual. We're going to be talking about some monster-related stuff and things. What are we talking about, John?
It's just interesting timing because I've been wanting to talk about monsters for a little while, and the 2025 Monster Manual just dropped, I think, late last week. Although I got my camera looks different. I got my fancy alternative cover copy at a local game store, which is my disclaimer that you should go to your local game stores to purchase said products.
Was it cheaper than online?
This game store was selling the regular cover Monster Manual for cheaper than Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah, it was like $40 instead of 50, which is a steal. And the alternative cover was 50 as usual. So I paid my extra $10 to get the fancy one. But so I figured we'd start with just thoughts on the Monster Manual because really it's no secret, I guess, depending on which circles of TTRPGs you run in, that the 2014 Monster Manual, the longer 5th edition went on, the longer it got in the tooth, the less useful it was because a lot of the monsters tended to hit lower than their challenge rating. That was like really the biggest complaint. And there was just a lot of information that made sense maybe from a role-playing perspective, but ended up being distracting from a functional running at the game perspective. So right. A good example is the mage stat block, which is a CR6. The mage was equipped with a dagger, and it could use its action to poke with a dagger for 1d4 plus 2 damage or whatever. And if you're looking at a CR6 creature, that is not the thing that you should be using. So in the new Monster Manual, they really got rid of a lot of that fluff and a lot of that distraction. And the clear goal was to have every possible route that the DM could take with actions hit for their challenge ratings. And so there's just this tendency that a lot of creatures either have an attack that just does more damage or an attack that does a little less damage but inflicts a condition. I think probably the most emblematic of that one would be the Hill Giant. They can hit hard with their club, but they also can lob trash, which is a range attack that can potentially poison a target. So the idea is, do you want to hit your enemy hard or do you want to hit the players with poison? So, right. Yeah, so it's overall, I love the product. I know that there have been criticisms toward it, some of which I think are more legitimate than others. A lot of them, personally, I feel are more clickbait worthy. Like, oh my goodness, they didn't sort the monsters the way I would want it sorted. Like, it's stuff like that. I don't really have a whole lot of overall major criticisms for it.
So I haven't taken a look at the new Dungeon Master's Guide or Monster Manual beyond like bits and pieces that I've seen online. I'm not really super tuned into D&D at this point. I got my own stuff going on, but one of the conflicts that it seems just laced through D&D's monsters is, like you said, the mage with the 1d4 dagger. It's the decision of, should I give all of the information about this creature to the players, or should we, what I'd lean toward, should we focus on the things that I can actually do? Because ultimately, the GM is going to use it however they're going to use it. So the goal for creating these monster stat blocks should lean more toward allowing you to run effective encounters. Like I think that's their purpose when it's boiled down. And it's funny, like there's only so much you can do to pare down information when it comes to monsters that really have a whole lot going on. And so the alternative is to kind of get rid of a bunch of the stuff that kind of won't be used, or like you can expect won't be used, and let the GM figure out how to make that stuff up, by giving them like proper tools. But when you're listing every single detail, the dagger, just even I have a problem with listing all the core stats. I mean, to some degree, I think it's more relevant in D&D. But if you just had the saves of each monster, like that to me is the more effective in between, instead of listing all the stats and listing all the modifiers that are on top of all those stats. So they were definitely kind of in a little bit of a rock and a hard place when it came to what they should pare down. Spell lists were another one, where does it make sense for you to, if you're trying to run this monster, does it make sense for you to glance at another book that you have to have on or nearby? Fortunately, VTTs make this process a lot easier, since you can quickly look things up. I mean, internet in general, but if you're playing traditional, then yeah, it's a challenge. And I think a lot of folks might have a hard time not slowing down the game in order to play these monsters effectively. Like, has anybody played a Lich effectively? Or have they just forgotten about, have you played a Lich effectively?
Nope. Not with the, let me clarify, not with the old rules.
Okay.
So because the first time I ran a Lich, first of all, it was 2 a.m. But it had shield prepared, and I kept forgetting about that. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't until after the game I'm like, that fight would have gone a lot differently if I had remembered I had shield.
Exactly. Like, there is just so much going on at any given time. And the decision that we need to make as designers is, who are we actually writing monsters for? So players, like, you want to give them a lot of agency, because they're only tracking one thing. It's their character sheet and all the bells and whistles that come with that. And you want them to explore their options and have very granular control. But when it comes to monsters, you really just want to create the opportunity for players to exert their will on the battlefield. So it's just a different paradigm. The way that Distal handles some of this stuff is, I specifically designed the monsters to be run as effectively as I can manage. I try to keep all the stat blocks to the size of an index card, maybe. I was really hoping to fit them on baseball card style, but some of the monsters, even so, get a little lengthy, but nowhere near what exists in D&D. So I do a number of things that hopefully expedite the process, while also maintaining the flavor and also providing options for how you can run these monsters. But before we get into that, because there's a lot, what is your, what's your favorite change from 2014 to 2024 about how they now handle monsters versus how they have handled them previously?
I think it comes to a lot of what you just mentioned, which is that in terms of action options, they've made them a lot more concise and a lot more obvious. So speaking of Lich adjacent, the Archmage, it was one of the first monsters I really looked at, because I've run them in games to the 2014 version, and they had a 15 armor class and 99 hit points. And yes, they could cast Time Stop, but I pretty much anytime I threw up an Archmage, it just got destroyed. One of the things that they did for the Archmage in particular is, instead of worrying about a lot of spells, they just were you get 4 Force Blasts or something. I don't even remember what it's called, but basically it's flavored as magic, but it's as simple as a regular attack. And the way I can describe it is as some kind of magical thing that the Archmage can do. And its hit points and armor class are now 17 and in the 100 something. I think it maybe went up from 99 to 170, which is significant. So all the monsters feel like their challenge rating, from my experience having play tested 4 or 5 combats.
Okay, so break down how an encounter would have gone in 2014 against the Archmage.
A lot of it also comes down to initiative. A lot of monsters have a ridiculous initiative bonus now. So normally what would have happened is maybe the Archmage would have gone first. Maybe it would have gone last. It was really swingy because I think it had a +2 initiative bonus. And so if 2 or 3 characters go first, chances are it's dead before it can even do anything. When I play tested against the new Beholder, which used to have a +2 initiative, it now has a +12. So one character rolled a natural 20 on the die. So with their initiative modifier, they were able to go before the Beholder. But the difference was in 2014 when I'd run monsters, what would often happen is players would go first, hit the monster really hard, and put the monster in a reactive position. Because initiative has been boosted across almost all monsters, it feels the opposite. It feels like the monster starts with something that hits really hard, and now the players are trying to recover and have to think through almost like a chess match what their best option is to, survive to the next round.
Right. So that pain point was initiative is a problem where it can totally change the way that an encounter is supposed to play out. And ways to solve for that problem are, GM can just say that their character goes first, their creature goes first, and thematically that might make sense. But there's a few problems. First of which is a lack of permission. If you're not baking the permission into the game system and creating that baseline expectation for like, hey, if it doesn't make sense for this story to work out this way, then do it in the way that does make sense. There's a bunch of rules that lean themselves toward this, like in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's a bunch of I think that's where you find most of the optional rules and the permission to do things. But I think that we naturally kind of like rebel against it, because rules as written are, or the way that everybody plays or most people play or whatever has been so ingrained that it's difficult for us to find a good excuse to do something that is maybe more fitting, for the benefit of the eventual benefit of the players. So I'm a strong believer in having a system that bakes in the permission as clearly as you possibly can to say, no, actually, this is the way that you want to run the game. So, for example, Distal, the getting into initiative it's narrative, where the GM will probably ask you to roll a perception or something like that. And then if you fail, the GM chooses which monster goes first. So if it's a dagger that flies from the shadows, like that's naturally makes sense for that monster to go. Everybody doesn't roll initiative, because you don't want to have the monster that's way in the back be the first thing that notices you randomly. It doesn't really make sense, right? The players choose amongst themselves which of them will go next, and then the GM will choose which of its monsters goes next. And it's meant to form like a natural, like, okay, who should go based on what just happened. And at the same time, it gives the players the agency that we talked about to develop strategies where, if they know that the party's been working together for years, then they probably have a typical like operating procedure a rhythm that they fall into. Like, oh, I'm going to go first because I'm the tank and I'm going to get in everybody's face. Or, I'm going to control because we always do this to set up other attacks. Like, it lets the party have this like meta puzzle to figure out when it comes to just, how they should play with one another. So it's giving them more tools while at the same time alleviating some of the tragedy that can occur by virtue of having an initiative be rolled naturally.
Yeah, just to quickly comment on the permission thing. What I find really interesting is first, in the new monster manual, they do put next to the initiative bonus a static initiative. So again, baking in the idea that if you don't want to roll for the Beholder, you can just say the Beholder goes on initiative count 22 and let the players randomly determine up or down where it goes or where they go. And the other thing that I think is a legitimate criticism is that neither in the Monster Manual nor in the Dungeon Master's Guide are there transparent rules for creating your own monsters, like there was in 2014. They don't really show you the underlying math. There are some customization options where they're like, do you want an Arctic creature? Give them cold resistance, but there's not the same in-depth kind of peek behind the curtain that there was in 2014. So for someone like me, I don't care. I'll make up numbers however I want to make it fit. But for a lot of people, they want that permission and the peek behind the curtain so they know that they're doing it quote unquote correctly.
Yeah, I remember us having way back, we had a session where I kind of sort of complained about like created like a whirlwind or something like that, or a dervish that then like took down resistances on a creature that we were having a hard time with, and like to you, it made sense for that to happen. To me, I was like that feels like cheating, and so there is this like opposition between rules as written and the stuff that you think is going to be the most fun makes the most sense. And actually, in that case, I'm pretty sure you planned for it, and we understood like after the fact that I don't know if you remember the encounter that I'm talking about. There was like a golem maybe or something.
Yeah,
like that. Yeah,
I do. So for people listening, the summary of it is they were in a mine where they mined jewels that could channel magical energy. And the villain of the campaign had sent a golem to basically mine stuff for them. So what had happened is when you cast your whirlwind spell, it swept up a lot of these crystals, and those crystals interrupted the magic that animated the golem, which made it more susceptible to weapon attacks. So again, in my mind, story-wise, that was kind of like the trick of the fight, was using the environment in some sort of way to interrupt the assumption that the golem is going to be animated forever. But also, if you want more of a challenge, that the vulnerability was really obvious. And I totally understood where you were coming from, where you wanted a more in-depth technical struggle. And that came from a DM balancing place. I've had other players in that campaign as a majority be like, I don't want that. I want to have like an easier win button, or the big red eyeball on top of the Zelda boss to aim at. So I made a judgment call on what I thought would be best for the majority.
Right. And doing that sort of thing totally makes sense. And it is supported, and that's the way that you should play, in my opinion. And at the same time, there was just like a personal grievance because I can't point to something in the book that says like, oh, this is legit. Actually, this is what you're doing right now. And this weird little rules lawyery feeling, I think is kind of pervasive in Dungeons and Dragons. I couldn't even put a finger on exactly why that is. But because it does exist, providing permission is really important to me. So one of the other things that I do for Distal's monsters in particular is they have an alternate health value next to them. So they have the standard health, but I clearly state like it's in the stat block. In parentheses, there's a different health value, and it says use this health value when the combat isn't going as fast as, or like when the combat's going too fast, or to represent like a monster that's either stronger than the others or a higher level or whatever. And like just to use it as a ripcord, because you always need to prioritize the fun over the plan that you had at the start. Like you might think that you balance things correctly. Most often is not true. Because I mean, in my experience, and maybe that's just a get good situation. I just need to hone my skills. But in general, I'm trying to make that permission very blatant, because I know that I've had issues in the past. I ran like an Aboleth encounter that just got straight up destroyed by a paladin because of a few good rolls and a bunch of smites. And I was like, I did not want that to operate this way. And 2 or 3 rounds in, it's just like, okay, well, I guess we're done now. When if I could have said just like, its health is actually this much because we know we want this to be fun. Because even the players were disappointed, and I was like, well, that's what I planned for, and them's the rules. So it's this weird paradigm that I have to like, that I know I have a personal struggle with. So again, permission, clarity, in your face rules helps with that, at least for me.
Yeah, well, and to go back to this golem fight, like I tend to design encounters like that, where if you think of like the whirlwind on the spell gems as an alternative health value, it's basically like this is a big, powerful creature that you can take down through the normal rules. But if you want to be clever or you want to just make something up, there usually is like a big red self-destruct button if you want to find it. So the balancing side is how much damage does it do? You know, because if it's like they figure out the button on turn 1 and they just press it and the encounter's done, that's not a fun game either. So part of it was is just figuring out, you know, does it make them do extra damage? How much extra damage should that be? For the system I'm developing, one thing I'm playing with is, instead of vulnerability being double damage, vulnerability is like an extra die. So kind of like Divine Smite against fiends and undead. So if it's vulnerable to fire damage, it doesn't take double 70 to 140. It takes 70 plus another D8. So you feel rewarded for having figured out the vulnerability, but it's not going to be such a big advantage that now you don't have to think about the fight anymore.
Yeah, figuring out how to balance that reward, because you want to feel good about the things that you're doing, right? Is definitely a trick as well. In your encounters, how many different types of monsters do you tend to run?
Ooh, that's a great question. For me personally, I found the sweet spot is one boss and a bunch of minions. So 2 distinct types. I've played with more, but that's just a lot of stat blocks to manage. I can't hold that much information in my head. So I usually cap it at 2 different creatures. If I'm feeling real spicy or it's like an end of campaign encounter, sometimes I'll pop it up to 3. But it's rarely ever more than that.
Yeah. The prevailing wisdom, at least in 2014, is to have 3 different monsters that have distinctly different roles in the combat. And that is, knowing the 2014 stat blocks and even knowing the 2024 potential stat blocks. Again, I haven't seen the book, but it's just a lot. It's a lot to hold in your head. It's a lot to manage. You're going to miss a bunch of stuff, different abilities and spells and resistances or whatever else. So one of the attempts at a solution for this, I don't know that I nailed it, but one of the goals for the monsters in Distal is to just be able to run one of the same type of monster and still have it be a really compelling, interesting encounter by virtue of the different things that they can do. And instead of holding all that information in your head, like, okay, how do I use different abilities and that sort of thing, the monsters are individually set up with different behaviors, which is, it's a list of 4 to 6 things that you can roll on, and you don't have to, but you can roll on that table and figure out what the monster wants to do. So these are different attacks. These are different, and all the attacks tend to have, like, it's not mostly damage. It's like damage and then some other thing, or it like sets you up to do other cool things later. For example, like a really low tier monster is these creeping vines, and there's a few notes in the stat block. First of which is that they're drawn to light, so it's a little bit of guidance just passively on what they try to like guidance on how to run them, basically, just in a single sentence. And they also they're segmented, which is this is different, something that I'm playing around with and I haven't seen in other games. It probably exists, but their body spans over multiple segments, and they actually grow toward the light, so a new segment spawns. But one of the abilities, yeah, it'll like try to slow you, essentially, or encumber is what we call that, 50% slow in this game. And then there's another ability, like if they're encumbered, then you can pin them, or you can like mute them. It's to represent like the vines winding their way around you. If they're like pinned or restrained or whatever, like a vine can pull you, like pass you along its segments, or to other vines. And this is like a low level monster. So the monster itself is the scenario, to where you can put a bunch of monsters in. You know that there's like a light source. You know that they're going to be attracted and grow toward maybe the torches that people are carrying, or like the lights, magical light source that they might have on to see in the darkness. And as they do that, they're going to be interacting with one another to, slow you down and to pull you away and to like try to crush you. And the players will have to solve what's essentially that puzzle. Like, do they turn out the light so that there's no more growth involved? Do they try to distract the plants by throwing a light source somewhere else so that it grows toward that? Do they just straight up like try to chop up all the vines? A lot of the monsters in this game operate with the idea that there are multiple steps, multiple behaviors that the players will need to learn over time. And again, what it comes down to is like the monster is the puzzle, and you can mix and match, but that's what I tried to achieve.
So when I ran playtest combats, they were at 13th level. And they were all at 13th level because in 2014, that was about the level that I started being less comfortable with the math, where if it was like levels 1 through 10, whenever I design a combat, sometimes something unexpected would happen, but for the most part, I was pretty satisfied with how the fight ran. Once we started hitting level 11 and players started getting 6th level spells, that's when there's way wider gaps between powerful characters and less optimized characters. And so one of the things I was pleased about running a lot of these monsters is what you just said, how a lot of times they ended up more like a puzzle, where spellcasters are looking at their sheet, thinking through like, oh, this is a spell that counters this ability that this monster has, or I have, greater restoration because the beholder just petrified one of my allies. So I love that tendency toward monster encounters being puzzles to solve. And I also don't think it would be that hard if you're playing D&D to just map out the behaviors like you said. Like I said, one of the goals was to make the routes a lot more obvious of like, am I going to fire my arcane bolts 4 times, or am I going to cast Cone of Cold? Like, so to just have like a little D4, D6 table. I mentioned beholders in particular because one of the things I love about them is every turn you roll a D10 to see which of the eye rays go off. And there's something fun about that unpredictability and that randomness. Even if story-wise your archmage is like a cutting spellcaster that will always choose the smart option, having the ability to be able to just see what's going to happen. Is this the turn they cast Cone of Cold? I find that really fun personally.
Yeah, it's like delight and surprise on not just for the party, but for the DM as well, because we're players too. It's fun to we're trying to facilitate the story, but one of the concerns actually in MCDM's game Draw Steel is that they wanted to remove the rolling from the GM side, and the feedback that they got was that the GMs want to roll too, which is totally legit. Probably makes sense to do that in a different game because you can keep things moving, super quick. And so it's an interesting thing because the way that we design monsters needs to be something that we can run easily, but also needs to lend itself to the encounter design. Needs to not feel more like accounting and feel more like play, which it can be a difficult balance to pull off.
So like there's complexity versus depth, right? So I think we've talked about it before, where complexity is how difficult it is to understand what your options are. Depth is how many actual choices you have. So for example, checkers to chess, chess is more complex and has more depth than checkers. But they aren't always in proportion. Like Magic the Gathering, hugely complex game, But when you get down to competitive choices, it's a lot slimmer than than all of the possible choices that you have. There is I think there's a trend to want to make things more simple to run to reduce complexity. And the hard part is also sometimes adding a little complexity is a good thing, because it adds a layer of depth that normally wouldn't be there. And sometimes it's just more fun. So personally in design, I think it's good to have simpler monster options, but also more complex monster options. If nothing else, than to just keep things spicy. Yeah. have there be an element of surprise among your players.
No, for sure. I mean, and GMs operate in different ways too. So I have a GM in the Discord who runs very, like the encounters are, there's a lot going on. There's just like a lot of monsters, numerous different types of monsters, and they're totally cool doing that. And I think that's probably what makes part of the fun for that GM in particular. So if you don't at least have opportunities for people to tailor to their own styles of GMing or their own styles of play, then yeah, you'll end up with a shallow game like checkers instead of something like chess. You do need that level of complexity, and it's really unfortunate that we've complexity has become kind of like a bad word throughout the game design space, and it's not a binary choice. It's not like, oh, it's complex, which is bad, or deep, which is good. It's one helps facilitate the others a lot. So you need to create vectors to increase the complexity, but not so many that you bog the game down, and again it becomes more accounting.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to who you think your ideal player group is. I know a GM that loves Baldur's Gate. And so the complexity that comes with Baldur's Gate, which can be partially tracked by a computer, there's a lot of fun in resource management and, combining different character abilities. And if you have a group like mine, where you have more than 2 monster types, and that starts to be a lot to keep track of for everybody, it's not going to be a style that matches. So GMs are put in the unique position where they almost have to think like a game designer on the fly, and the more they understand who their players are, the more they can design encounters that will delight them. So as a player, there have been plenty of times where I've been in a combat where there are 4 or 5 different monster types. And in the moment, I found that really exciting. There have been other times where a GM has tried that and I've rolled my eyes. So part of the difficulty is that it can be kind of like a day-by-day, roster-by-roster thing. Because in those times I've rolled my eyes, it's because other players have gotten really confused and it slowed the game down. So part of the complexity isn't just what's happening on the GM side of the screen. What can your players handle? And you can teach them to increase the capacity for complexity. And I think a lot of GMs want to skip right to the end instead of kind of building their players' skill sets over time. So those are just some things to kind of think about as you're designing encounters.
Honestly, that's a really good point. At the end, like a lot of our games, I know we were ready to wrap this up, but I want to kind of course correct.
Keep going.
So that thought of building your players' skill sets up over time is super important. That's why we oftentimes have low complexity monsters at the start, and then the monsters themselves ramp up into complexity, because there's an expectation that not only are they stronger, but more of the understanding of how the game works will be gained by virtue of having lower level players become more acclimated to new features as they're slowly introduced.
Just one trap to avoid for GMs, because I've seen this happen a few times. Don't assume that your players, for lack of a nicer term, your players' level of competence is static. There were times during the pandemic where I was running 3 games a week, and I was playing a lot with the same players, and we were very into D&D 5th edition, and they knew spells, they knew DCs, they were really into it. Same group of players after a 6-month hiatus can't remember what their bonus actions are. So like part of this has to do with momentum and frequency of play. So when I was playing with my grandma once every other month, I knew, and I was very upfront with the fact that this game is never getting beyond a simple complexity because the players couldn't remember NPCs or details. I wasn't even going to try, and we still had a fun time with it. It wasn't as immersive or deep as my pandemic game, but also it had to do with how much the players were willing to invest. So, and sometimes they surprise you. Sometimes you're like, this player doesn't really seem to be able to keep track of stuff. And then they end up getting really immersed. So my point is none of this stuff is really static, which is what's kind of difficult about it.
Word. All right. Well, I think that's where we're going to end it. If you found this video interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel. And if you want to pick up Distal, you can do that in the video description below. Or John, you have a podcast.
Oh, yeah. If you want to look up Dragon Mind, Mindful TTRPGs on Spotify and YouTube. I am about to wrap up my series covering D&D 2024 and all my thoughts about it.
Word. For better and for worse. All right. Thank you very much, folks. Wrel signing off.